Doubting her integrity, he sets a trap to test her trustworthiness. Her unexpected response not only silences his suspicions, but also teaches him an invaluable lesson about character and humility. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The morning sun streamed through the vast windows of the Bennett mansion, casting long shadows across marble floors that cost more than most people's homes. Arthur Bennett stood at his bedroom window, watching the staff arrive for another day of work. At 65, his success had brought him everything money could buy, yet his reflection in the window showed a man who had everything and nothing at once. His morning routine never varied. Coffee at precisely 7 a.m., newspaper at 7:15, and a slow walk through his empty house, pretending to check that everything was in order. In reality, he was just killing time. The sound of activity from the kitchen below caught his attention. Lucia Johnson had arrived, right on schedule as she had for the past 5 years. Arthur's footsteps echoed through the hallway as he descended the grand staircase. The house staff lowered their eyes and quickly found reasons to be elsewhere. He had cultivated this response over years of maintaining strict professional distances. Only Lucia maintained eye contact, offering a quiet "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," before returning to her work. Across town, in a modest 2-bedroom apartment, Lucia's children were getting ready for school. Her oldest, Marcus, helped his younger sister tie her shoes while Lucia prepared their lunches. The small kitchen was cramped but spotless, much like the rest of their home. A photo of James, her late husband, watched over them from its place on the refrigerator. "Daddy would be proud of you both," Lucia said, handing them their lunch bags. The words caught in her throat, as they often did when she mentioned James. 3 years had passed since the accident that took him, but the weight of single parenthood still felt new some mornings. Marcus, at 12, already understood too much about adult responsibilities. "We'll be okay, Mom," he said, shouldering his backpack. "Mrs. Torres said she'd watch Sarah after school until you get home." Back at the mansion, Arthur sat in his study, reviewing the household accounts. His accountant had flagged some discrepancies in the kitchen expenses. Minor variances that could be explained away by inflation or market fluctuations. But Arthur's mind wandered to darker possibilities. He'd overheard Winston, his gardener, mentioning something about Lucia taking extra food home. The rational part of his brain knew he should simply ask her about it. Yet years of isolation and cynicism had warped his approach to human interaction. Trust, in Arthur's experience, needed to be tested rather than given. He'd built his fortune on this principle, and it hadn't failed him yet. He watched through his study window as Lucia organized the pantry, her movements efficient and practiced. She had never given him reason to doubt her integrity before, but neither had any of the business partners who had eventually betrayed him. The thought of another betrayal, even on this small scale, stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. The rumors about the kitchen expenses wouldn't leave his mind. They fed into his deep-seated belief that everyone, given the opportunity, would choose self-interest over honesty. His fingers drummed against his desk as he considered his options. A test would provide clarity. It would either confirm his suspicions or prove them wrong. But either way, he would know the truth. The decision settled in his mind like a weight. He would create a situation to test Lucia's honesty, something that would leave no room for ambiguity. As he began to formulate his plan, a small voice in the back of his mind wondered if he was about to make a terrible mistake. Arthur chose a Wednesday for his test. He knew Lucia cleaned his study early on Wednesdays, before the rest of the household stirred to full activity. The morning light had barely touched the horizon when he carefully arranged $5,000 in crisp $100 bills on his desk. The sum was significant enough to tempt, but not so large as to seem obviously suspicious. He positioned the money carelessly, as if he had absent-mindedly left it out after counting it. A few bills hung slightly over the desk's edge, drawing attention to themselves. Arthur had staged similar scenarios countless times in his business dealings. He understood the psychology of temptation. From his hidden position in the adjacent room, connected by a discreet door left slightly ajar, Arthur could observe everything. He had arrived an hour earlier than usual, his heart beating with an uncomfortable rhythm he hadn't felt in years. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of the heating system. At precisely 7:15 a.m., Lucia's footsteps echoed in the hallway. Arthur held his breath. She entered the study with her usual cleaning supplies, humming softly to herself. The melody stopped abruptly when she noticed the money on the desk. Lucia stood motionless for several long seconds. From his vantage point, Arthur could see her hands tighten around the handle of her cleaning bucket. She approached the desk slowly, as if the money might vanish like a mirage. In that moment, Lucia's mind raced through a cascade of urgent needs. Marcus needed new shoes for track. Sarah's asthma medication wasn't covered by insurance this month, and the rent had increased again. The amount before her could solve so many problems. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her cleaning supplies. Arthur leaned forward in his hiding spot, his own breath shallow. He had staged similar tests throughout his career, watching as supposedly loyal employees and partners revealed their true nature. The anticipation was familiar, almost comfortable, yet something felt different this time. Lucia reached out toward the money, and Arthur felt a mixture of triumph and disappointment surge through him. But her hand moved past the bills to straighten them into a neat stack. She lifted the stack carefully, as if handling something fragile and dangerous at the same time. The weight of the money in her hands felt both liberating and suffocating. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine what she could do with it. Pay off the mounting medical bills, maybe even start a small college fund for the kids. The temptation was like a physical presence in the room. Arthur watched intently as emotions played across Lucia's face. In his experience, this was usually the moment when people justified their actions to themselves, when they convinced themselves that they deserved what they were about to take. But Lucia's expression shifted from longing to resolution. She squared her shoulders, a gesture Arthur had seen countless times when she faced difficult tasks. The money in her hands seemed to weigh heavier now, but for different reasons. Time seemed to slow as Lucia looked around the study, clearly searching for somewhere secure to place the money. Arthur felt an unfamiliar tension in his chest. This wasn't following the usual pattern of his tests. Usually, by now, the subject would have either taken the money or pretended not to see it. Finally, Lucia opened the top drawer of Arthur's desk, the one she knew he used for important documents, and carefully placed the stack inside. Her movements were deliberate, respectful. She closed the drawer with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silent room. Lucia's decision to return the money set in motion a chain of events neither she nor Arthur had anticipated. She walked purposefully through the mansion's corridors, her cleaning supplies forgotten in the study, searching for Arthur. She found him emerging from the connecting room, his presence surprising her. "M.R. Bennett," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I found something in your study that you should know about." She met his eyes directly, showing neither pride nor submission. "There's a significant amount of money in your desk drawer. I thought you should be aware." Arthur stood frozen, caught off guard by the directness of her approach. In all his years of testing people, no one had ever confronted him so immediately. He had prepared himself for either theft or nervous avoidance, but not this straightforward honesty. "The money," he started, then paused, suddenly unsure of how to proceed. I left it there deliberately, Mrs. Johnson." Understanding dawned on Lucia's face, followed by a flash of hurt that she quickly masked. "You were testing me," she stated rather than asked. 20 years of dealing with subtle and not-so-subtle prejudices had taught her to recognize such moments. "Yes," Arthur admitted, finding himself unable to manufacture a plausible excuse. The carefully constructed walls of his cynicism began to show their first cracks. Lucia squared her shoulders, drawing herself up to her full height. "Mr. Bennett, I've worked in this house for 5 years. I've cleaned your study, handled your laundry, prepared your meals. If I wanted to steal from you, I've had countless opportunities." Her words struck Arthur with unexpected force. She was right, of course. She had access to valuables worth far more than the cash he'd left out, yet nothing had ever gone missing. "I heard rumors," he said, his justification sounding weak even to his own ears, "about kitchen expenses. The food costs have gone up because I've been preparing larger portions since you mentioned having trouble sleeping," Lucia replied. A full meal helps with insomnia, something my husband used to struggle with before. She stopped, emotion briefly overwhelming her. Arthur watched as she collected herself, continuing with quiet dignity. James, my husband, he died 3 years ago. Left me with 2 children and more bills than I care to count. But he taught our children that integrity isn't something you can buy or sell. It's all we really own. The silence that followed her words felt heavy with unspoken truths. Arthur found himself remembering his own father's lessons about trust and suspicion, wondering when he'd allowed cynicism to overshadow wisdom. Every day, Lucia continued, her voice growing stronger. I teach my children that honest work brings more than just money. It brings dignity. Marcus, my son, he asks why I work such long hours. I tell him it's because honest work, no matter what kind, deserves our best effort. Arthur sank into his office chair, the weight of his misjudgment pressing down on him. Mrs. Johnson, Lucia, he corrected himself, using her first name for the first time in 5 years. I owe you an apology. No, Mr. Bennett, she replied. What you owe me is the same thing I give you, respect and trust. I'm a mother working to give her children a better life, not a thief waiting for an opportunity. In that moment, Arthur saw Lucia clearly for the first time, not as an employee to be tested, but as a person whose integrity had been forged in struggles he could barely imagine. The realization made him deeply uncomfortable with his own actions. In the days following the failed test, Arthur found himself in unfamiliar emotional territory. His usual routine felt hollow, tainted by the awareness of his own prejudices. He began watching Lucia with new eyes, noticing things he'd overlooked for years. How she hummed gospel songs while working, the gentle way she handled family photos during dusting, her quiet efficiency that kept his world running smoothly. One morning, he overheard her on the phone during her break, discussing payment plans for her daughter's asthma medication. Her voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to making difficult choices, yet maintained its characteristic strength. Hey! Arthur remained in the hallway, an unexpected ache in his chest as he listened to her navigate the healthcare system with practiced patience. Perhaps we could split the payment across 3 months, Lucia was saying, her voice low but clear. I understand your policy, but my daughter needs this medication. Arthur retreated to his study, his coffee growing cold as he wrestled with thoughts he'd long suppressed. The mansion around him, with its carefully curated artwork and expensive furnishings, suddenly seemed less like an achievement and more like a fortress he'd built to keep the world at bay. Later that afternoon, he called Lucia into his study. She entered with the same dignity she'd shown during their confrontation, neither submissive nor defensive. Yes, Mr. Bennett? Please sit down. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat, her posture straight, hands folded in her lap. I've been thinking about our conversation the other day. There's nothing more to discuss about that, Mr. Bennett, Lucia began, but Arthur held up his hand. There is. I've spent my life building walls, Lucia, testing people, expecting the worst, and usually finding it because that's what I was looking for. He paused, organizing thoughts that felt foreign on his tongue. But you showed me something different. Lucia remained silent, watching him with careful attention. Arthur continued, I'd like to know more about your family, your children, not as your employer, but as someone who, he struggled for the right words, someone who wants to understand. Surprise flickered across Lucia's face, quickly replaced by cautious warmth. Marcus is 12, she began slowly. He's on the track team at school. Sarah's 8, top of her class in mathematics despite missing days for her asthma. They're good kids, Mr. Bennett. Their father would be proud. Tell me about their father, Arthur said softly, surprising himself with his genuine interest. Lucia's eyes grew distant with memory. James was a construction worker. He believed in building things that last, buildings, relationships, trust. The accident happened on a site where they cut corners on safety equipment. Her voice remained steady, but her hands tightened in her lap. He taught our children that character is built the same way as a strong foundation. Carefully, deliberately, with attention to detail. Arthur nodded, understanding flowing through him like a slow tide. Your children, do they have what they need? We manage, Lucia replied with quiet pride. It's not always easy, but we manage. The medication I heard you discussing. Lucia straightened, her professional mask slipping back into place. That's not something you need to concern yourself with, Mr. Bennett. But I want to, he said, surprising them both with his vehemence. Not out of pity or guilt, but because... He paused, recognizing a truth he hadn't known he was carrying. Because you've shown me what real integrity looks like, and I want to learn from that. Arthur's transformation from isolated millionaire to community participant began with a simple phone call to his bank. He arranged to cover Sarah's medical expenses, not as charity, but as an adjustment to Lucia's employment benefits. It was the first decision he'd made in years that wasn't calculated for maximum personal advantage. His next step surprised even himself. After researching local community organizations, he walked into the downtown community center, a building he'd driven past countless times without a second glance. The peeling paint and outdated facilities told a story of chronic underfunding. Mr. Bennett, the center's director, Maria Rodriguez, couldn't hide her shock at seeing him there. What brings you to our humble establishment? I want to understand, he said simply. Show me what you do here. For the next 2 hours, Maria led him through the center's programs. After-school tutoring for kids whose NTS worked late, job training for single parents, a food bank operating on desperately thin resources. Arthur saw pieces of Lucia's story reflected in every person he met. Back at the mansion, Lucia noticed subtle changes in Arthur's behavior. His morning routine now included questions about her children. How did Marcus do at his track meet? Or is Sarah's breathing better with the new medication? Small questions that revealed a growing awareness of life beyond his walls. One morning, Arthur called Lucia into his study again. This time, blueprints covered his desk. I'm thinking of renovating the community center, he explained, watching her reaction carefully. But I need someone who understands what the community actually needs, not just what I think they need. Lucia studied the plans, her practical experience showing in her comments. The kitchen's too small for the cooking classes they want to offer, she noted. And they need more computer stations for the job training program. Arthur found himself taking notes, absorbing her insights like a student. Would you help me with this? He asked. Be my liaison with the community? Why are you doing this? Lucia asked directly, her eyes searching his face for hidden motives. Because you showed me that wealth without purpose is just numbers in a bank account, he replied. I've spent years accumulating money and influence. Maybe it's time I did something meaningful with it. The renovation project became their shared mission. Arthur provided the resources, but it was Lucia who helped him understand how to use them effectively. She introduced him to families struggling with the same challenges she faced, and he learned to listen more than he spoke. Word spread through the community about the changes at the Bennett Mansion. The isolated millionaire was becoming a familiar face at community events. Some welcomed the change with open arms, while others remained skeptical of his motives. One evening, as Arthur reviewed donation proposals in his study, Lucia brought him his usual evening tea. The center's cooking class is full, she reported. They're talking about adding another session. Arthur nodded, then asked something that had been on his mind. Do your children know about the test? About what happened? Lucia set down the tea tray carefully. No, she said. Some lessons our children need to learn on their own. But they know something's different. Marcus asked why you came to his track meet last week. And what did you tell him? I told him that sometimes people surprise us by growing into better versions of themselves, she answered. Just like his father always said they could. Arthur's study, once a fortress of solitude, had become the planning center for what he envisioned as the community's largest fundraising event. Spreadsheets and event proposals covered every surface, replacing his usual financial reports. He'd committed to matching every dollar raised, but money wasn't the primary goal. He wanted to bridge the gap between his world and the community he'd ignored for so long. The ballroom can hold 300 people, Arthur explained to the planning committee gathered in his study. The group included Lucia, Maria from the community center, and several local business owners who still watched him with barely concealed suspicion. We'll transform it into a celebration of local talent and achievement. Lucia, now comfortable in her expanded role as community liaison, added, several students from the center's music program have offered to perform, and the cooking class wants to cater part of the event. Not everyone shared their enthusiasm. Thomas Parker, a longtime community activist, spoke up. "With all due respect, Mr. Bennett, why should we trust this sudden interest in our community? People like you don't usually care about our problems unless there's something in it for them." The old Arthur would have responded with defensive anger. Instead, he okayed at Lucia, drawing strength from her steady presence. "You're right to be suspicious, Mr. Parker. I haven't earned your trust yet, but I'm hoping you'll give me the chance to try." As the planning progressed, Arthur insisted on personal involvement in every detail. He learned the names of the student performers, listened to their rehearsals, and made sure they had proper instruments. He worked alongside the cooking class participants, letting them teach him about their traditional recipes. Behind the scenes, resistance continued. Anonymous letters arrived questioning his motives. Some longtime donors threatened to withdraw their support from community programs if they aligned too closely with him. The whispers reached Lucia's ears. He's just trying to buy good publicity or wait until he shows his true colors. One evening, as they reviewed the guest list, Lucia noticed Arthur's distraction. "The comments are getting to you," she observed. "Not the way you might think," he replied. "I keep wondering if they're right. Am I doing this for the right reasons? Or am I just trying to make myself feel better about years of indifference?" "Does it matter?" Lucia asked. "The children at the center don't care about your motives when they're using the new computers to do their homework. The single mothers don't question your sincerity when they're learning job skills that could change their lives." Arthur absorbed her words, then shared something he'd never told anyone. "When I first made my fortune, I thought money would fix everything, but it just built bigger walls. Now I'm trying to tear them down, and I'm not sure I know how." "You start with one brick at a time," Lucia replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Like you're doing now." As the event date approached, the mansion buzzed with activity. Local artists transformed the ballroom with murals celebrating community life. The kitchen filled with the aromas of dishes from a dozen different cultural traditions. Student musicians practiced in every available space. Arthur found himself drawn to a young pianist, a 12-year-old girl named Maya, whose father worked 2 jobs to pay for her lessons. "My old piano is gathering dust in the West Wing," he told her. "Would you like to practice on it?" The girl's face lit up, but her father stepped forward protectively. "We can't afford to pay for use of a grand piano, Mr. Bennett. The music is payment enough," Arthur replied, understanding for the first time what real wealth meant. The night of the fundraiser arrived, transforming the Bennett mansion from a symbol of isolation into a vibrant community hub. String lights illuminated the garden paths, while the sound of jazz music, played by community center students, drifted through the open windows. The once imposing gates stood wide open, welcoming guests from all walks of life. Arthur stood in the entrance hall, greeting guests alongside Lucia. He wore a simple black suit, deliberately avoiding the ostentatious display of wealth that had once been his armor. Lucia, in a deep blue dress, handled introductions with natural grace, bridging the gap between Arthur's world and her own. "Mr. Chin's daughter is starting college next month," she murmured to Arthur as she guided him through conversations. "Mrs. Washington's grandson just won a regional science fair." Each detail helped Arthur connect names to stories, transforming strangers into neighbors. The early tension in the room began to dissolve as people mingled. Community center students proudly served their culinary creations to local business leaders. Maya, the young pianist, performed classical pieces on Arthur's grand piano, her music drawing appreciative crowds. Then came time for Arthur's speech. He approached the microphone, acutely aware of the diverse faces watching him. Some supportive, others still skeptical. He had prepared remarks, but as he looked out at the crowd, he set them aside. "For years," he began, his voice steady but humble, "I lived behind these walls, believing they protected me. What I didn't understand was that they were actually a prison of my own making. It took someone showing me true integrity to help me see that." His eyes found Lucia in the crowd, standing near her children. "This community has taught me that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts. It's measured in the strength of our connections in the hands we extend to help others up. As he spoke, a figure at the back of the room caught his attention. Robert Caldwell, his former business partner, watched with a predatory smile that Arthur recognized from countless boardroom battles. The sight of him sent a chill down Arthur's spine, but he continued his speech. "Tonight isn't about me," Arthur pressed on. "It's about what we can achieve when we stop seeing each other as statistics or stereotypes and start seeing each other as human beings." The applause that followed felt genuine, but Arthur barely heard it. He watched as Caldwell moved through the crowd toward him, that knowing smile still playing on his lips. Lucia, sensing his tension, appeared at his side. Arthur Bennett, the great philanthropist, Caldwell's voice carried just enough mockery to make several nearby guests turn. Such inspiring words from a man who once specialized in hostile takeovers and asset stripping. "Robert," Arthur acknowledged him coolly. "I wasn't aware you were on the guest list." "Oh, I wouldn't miss this for the world," Caldwell replied. "It's not every day you get to watch someone rewrite their history so dramatically." His eyes slid to Lucia, then back to Arthur. "Though I wonder if your new friends know the real Arthur Bennett." Lucia stepped forward, her presence both protective and challenging. "Sometimes," she said clearly, "who someone was matters less than who they're choosing to become." Caldwell's smile widened. "Noble sentiments, Mrs. Johnson. But did your employer tell you about the communities his business decisions destroyed? The families left jobless when he dismantled their companies for profit." The room had grown quiet, the jazz music fading away as guests tried to pretend they weren't listening. Arthur felt the weight of his past pressing down on him, threatening to crush this new foundation he'd been trying to build. The elegant fundraiser atmosphere crackled with tension as Caldwell's accusations hung in the air. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some drawing back while others leaned forward, eager to witness the unfolding drama. Arthur felt the familiar urge to retreat behind his walls of wealth and privilege, but Lucia's steady presence beside him helped him stand his ground. "Why don't we take this conversation somewhere private, Robert?" Arthur suggested, his voice controlled. "Oh, but I think your guests deserve to hear this." Caldwell projected his voice to reach the furthest corners of the ballroom. "Shall we talk about the Patterson manufacturing incident? 300 workers lost their jobs when you stripped that company for parts. Or maybe the Highland Community Bank takeover. How many small businesses failed when you called in their loans?" Arthur watched as faces in the crowd began to change, doubt and suspicion replacing the warmth of earlier moments. He saw Thomas Parker, the community activist, shaking his head slowly, as if his worst suspicions had been confirmed. "Yes, I did those things." Arthur's voice cut through the murmurs. "And worse, I built my fortune by seeing people as numbers on a spreadsheet, communities as assets to be leveraged. I won't deny it or try to justify it." The honesty of his response seemed to catch Caldwell off guard. He'd clearly expected denials or excuses. Lucia stepped forward, her voice clear and firm. "Mr. Caldwell, you came here to expose the past. But look around you. See what's actually happening in the present." She gestured to Maya, the young pianist, who stood near the grand piano. "That girl has a scholarship for music lessons now. The community center has new computers, job training programs, and a renovated kitchen that feeds 50 families every week." "Paid for with blood money," Caldwell sneered. "Paid for with money being returned to the community," Lucia corrected him. "You're right about the past, but you're wrong about what's happening now." Arthur found his voice again, stronger this time. "Every fortune I built came with a cost to others. I can't undo that damage, but I can choose what to do with those resources now." He turned to address the crowd directly. "Mr. Caldwell is right about who I was. I was exactly the kind of man he describes, cold, calculating, concerned only with profit. The kind of man who would test a trusted employee's honesty by leaving money out as a trap." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Arthur continued, "But that test didn't reveal what I expected. Instead, it showed me something about integrity, about the kind of person I had become and the kind of person I wanted to be." Caldwell laughed sharply. "And we're supposed to believe this convenient conversion? This sudden attack of conscience?" "You don't have to believe anything," Arthur replied. "Judge by actions, not words." Every dollar I made destroying communities is now going back into building them up. Every tactic I learned in hostile takeovers, I'm using to navigate city bureaucracy and get permits for community projects. Lucia watched Arthur with quiet pride, seeing him face his past without flinching. But she also noticed how some guests were already edging toward the exits, how others whispered behind raised hands. Years of community trust, already fragile, seemed to be crumbling under the weight of revealed truths. In the tense aftermath of Caldwell's revelations, Arthur made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He asked the event staff to close the doors, not to trap anyone, but to request a moment of their time. The gesture itself spoke volumes. The old Arthur Bennett would have let them leave, retreating behind his walls of wealth and privilege. "Please," he addressed the crowd, his voice lacking its usual polish. "You deserve the whole truth, not just pieces weaponized to hurt. Yes, I was a corporate raider. I dismantled companies, destroyed livelihoods, all in the name of profit. But let me tell you about the moment everything changed." He looked at Lucia, drawing strength from her presence. 3 months ago, I tested the honesty of the most decent person I've ever known. I left money out, expecting theft, looking for proof that everyone could be corrupted. Instead, I found my own corruption reflected back at me. The room was completely silent now. Even Caldwell stood motionless, his smug expression faltering slightly. That test revealed nothing about Lucia's character. It revealed everything about mine. I had become so cynical, so convinced of humanity's worst nature, that I couldn't recognize genuine integrity when it was right in front of me. Arthur moved to the center of the room, making eye contact with community members he'd come to know over the past months. Every accusation Mr. Caldwell made is true. But here's what he doesn't know. Every project we're working on now is designed to repair similar damage in other communities. The job training program? It's modeled after the skills lost when Patterson Manufacturing closed. The small business loans? They're structured to protect against the kind of predatory practices I once employed. Maria Rodriguez, the community center director, stepped forward. "I was skeptical of Mr. Bennett's intentions at first," she admitted to the crowd. "But I've watched him spend hours learning about our needs, not just throwing money at problems. He's attended every board meeting, visited families, listened to their stories." Thomas Parker, the activist who had been most vocal in his suspicions, cleared his throat. "How do we know this isn't just Ano? Their corporate strategy? A long-term investment in your image?" "You don't," Arthur replied simply. "I can't prove my sincerity. All I can do is continue the work, day by day, project by project. Judge me by my actions going forward." Lucia moved to stand beside him. "When my husband died," she began, her voice strong despite the personal nature of her words, "he left me with 2 lessons to teach our children. First, that integrity matters more than money, and second, that people can change when they choose to face themselves honestly." She turned to face Caldwell. "You came here to expose Mr. Bennett's past, but all you've done is show how far he's come from it. Every person in this room knows struggle, knows what it means to fight for change. We understand redemption because most of us have needed it at some point." The atmosphere in the room began to shift. Community members who had started to leave returned to their seats. Maya, the young pianist, walked to the piano and began to play softly, a hopeful melody that seemed to capture the moment's complexity. Arthur watched as people began to talk among themselves, saw head nods and thoughtful expressions replace looks of betrayal. He understood that trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired with a single speech or explanation. But perhaps, like the community center he was helping to rebuild, it could be reconstructed slowly, one brick at a time. Just as the atmosphere began to settle, Caldwell played his final card. His laughter cut through the room's tentative calm like a blade. "Oh, this is too perfect," he said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "Lucia Johnson, you speak so eloquently about integrity and redemption. But do you know who you really are?" Lucia stiffened, her composure wavering for the first time that evening. Arthur stepped forward protectively, but Caldwell was already speaking. "Your mother worked as a housekeeper too, didn't she? For a wealthy family in Atlanta, about 40 years ago." Caldwell's words carried deadly precision. Did she ever tell you about the man she worked for? About the relationship they had? The color drained from Lucia's face. Marcus and Sarah, who had been standing quietly with the other children, moved closer to their mother. "Stop this, Robert," Arthur warned, but Caldwell continued, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "I have here," he held up the envelope, "DNA test results and birth records. Your father wasn't the man who raised you, Lucia. Your father was Charles Wellington, the man your mother worked for, one of the wealthiest men in Atlanta at the time, and my former business partner." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Lucia stood frozen, her children clutching her hands as whispers erupted around them. Her whole identity, her understanding of herself and her family history seemed to waver like a mirage. "Mom!" Marcus's voice cracked with confusion. Arthur watched as Lucia straightened her spine, years of dignity and strength showing in her posture. "My father," she said clearly, "was James Johnson Sr. He worked 2 jobs to put food on our table. He taught me the meaning of honest work and true integrity. Biology doesn't change that." Caldwell's smile faltered at her composure. "You're the heir to the Wellington fortune. Millions of dollars that should have been yours. Didn't you ever wonder why your mother moved across the country so suddenly? Why she never spoke about that time? My mother," Lucia's voice remained steady, "did what she had to do to protect her family and her dignity. The only thing I wonder is how you sleep at night, using people's lives as weapons." Arthur moved to stand beside her. "Is this what you came here to do, Robert? Destroy a family's peace? Disrupt a community trying to heal?" "I came here to expose the truth about both of you," Caldwell snapped. "The corporate raider playing saint and the housekeeper with royal blood. It's almost poetic, but his words no lunch are carried the same power." The community members who had gathered around Lucia and her children formed a protective circle. Maya began playing again, a gentle melody that seemed to wrap around them like a shield. "The truth," Lucia addressed the room, her voice clear and strong, "is that we are who we choose to be. Mr. Bennett chose to change, to use his wealth to help others. I choose to honor the father who raised me, who taught me values no fortune could buy." She turned to her children, kneeling to meet their eyes. "Your grandfather was James Johnson Sr. He loved you before you were born, and his spirit lives in everything we do. No piece of paper can change that." Arthur looked at the family before him, not broken by Caldwell's revelation, but standing stronger together. He saw in them the same integrity that had first opened his eyes to his own failings and potential for change. The evening that had begun as a celebration of community, transformed by accusations and revelations, ended with a deeper understanding of what family and integrity truly meant. As guests departed, many stopped to embrace Lucia and her children, demonstrating that blood ties meant less than the bonds they had built together. Caldwell left alone, his envelope of revelations having failed to achieve the destruction he'd intended. In its place, he left something unexpected, a community more tightly bound by their shared understanding that everyone's story was complex, that integrity wasn't inherited but chosen, and that redemption was possible for those brave enough to change. The story ends not with a neat resolution, but with a beginning of new understandings, strengthened bonds, and the continued work of building something meaningful from the ruins of the past.